How's everybody doing? Good? You guys having a good conference so far? Yeah? It's a little like dark and sleepy in here, but we'll do all right. So hello everyone, my name is Sara Elliott. I'm the Director of Programs here at the Stone Barn Center for Food and Agriculture. Really excited to welcome you all today to a panel of really cool guys. We're going to talk about farmers cultivating restaurant relationships. So what we are going to be covering today is some ideas about what relationships between growers and restaurants, chefs, and other consumers might look like when they go beyond your typical supply-demand kind of a model. So that's what we're going to be exploring today together. So on our panel, we have Tyler Dennis from Alewife Farm, Andrew Luzmore from Blue Hill at Stone Barns, and Jason Grauer, who's a farmer here at Stone Barns. And can I ask each of you to just, maybe in a couple of minutes, just tell us a little bit about your operation and your role there, what you do. Great.
Yeah. I am the owner-operator of Alewife Farm. We have been in business for 4 years in the Hudson Valley. Currently, we're in Kingston, New York. We grow about 30 acres of mixed vegetables that we sell at the green markets in Manhattan. We go to Union Square on Mondays and Fridays, and we do one other market within Union Square. About 2/3 of our sales are to restaurants that we work with. We have a really strong, long-standing relationship with Blue Hill, who's by far our biggest single restaurant account. And I used to be an apprentice here on the farm as well.
Awesome.
I'm Andrew Luzmore. I wear many different hats here, but my official title is market forager. I often say purchaser just because I'm the person kind of on the ground at the farmers markets working with these guys. Just coordinating the daily harvest that's coming to the restaurants, the different farmers markets we're going to, and just kind of being the person that is trying to take the time to work out all these little details and things that need to really be put in place for these types of relationships to really take hold. So I spend my day not cooking, but kind of doing ordering, talking to growers, talking to cheesemakers, and all these different things, just to kind of have it all come together in the restaurant. And so we have the restaurant here and also a restaurant in the city, both of which are sourcing heavily from Stone Barn Center and also different farms at the market.
Great. Jason?
And my name's Jason Grauer, and I'm called the Crop Production Manager here at Stone Barns. So I'm managing all of the vegetable production, flower and herb production in our outdoor and indoor systems. And my job kind of splits into two directions. So one of them is to oversee the plant genetics work that we do, the breeding and trialing and working with breeders and seed saving and things that are going on site, as well as being the liaison to all of our outlets. So it's not just the managing of the growing of, what are we going to grow, when are we going to grow, what's the flow of the day, but also where's it going to go, and how does that work? So on site here at Stone Barns, we have right now 150 member CSA. We have a 5-day-a-week farm stand that acts like a mini farmer's market 5 days a week. We also have Blue Hill that we sell to, and both, as you'll probably mention, coordinating for both Blue Hill at Stone Barns and Blue Hill in New York. And then we have some other restaurant relationships, a relationship with a brewery, local Captain Lawrence, who buys all of our hops and a lot of our fruit as well to make some beers and do some interesting things with, as well as some of our produce in that direction too. And then another big part of it, which I think is very unique to us, is our education and programs teams. So they actually are purchasing vegetables from us and using them in unique ways to teach people about cooking and understanding food too.
Great, thank you guys. So I'm going to use about the first half of this session to lob questions at these guys, kind of get the conversation going, and then I will open it up to questions from you all. Just FYI, we are live streaming this session, so I'll remind you when we get to Q&A, I'm going to ask you guys to repeat the question before you answer it. So just a little note of business. But I'd love to kick us off with a question for you, Andrew. And the question is, how much of your time would you say on an average day or week do you spend talking to farmers, learning about product from them, and learning about their growing practices?
I think it's actually probably less than most people would think. I think most of our conversations are more maintenance than anything else. I think a lot of what we do together, both with Tyler and Stone Barns, is kind of planned out to the T in the winter. And so when we're in the middle of August, we're kind of in the middle of it, and it's very kind of hard to turn the ship. And so I always feel in my job, I'm much more of an advocate for the farm than I am for the restaurant, just because it's in the field, it's growing, it's going to bolt, and either we as a restaurant kind of get on track and follow their lead, or the whole thing falls off the tracks. And so I feel like most of our conversation is talking about numbers, talking about, is this going to go blue in New York? Is this going to not work out? Do we push it to the CSA? And it's these very kind of small conversations that take up most of our time. It's much less of, asking why are you guys growing this fennel versus that fennel. I think most of that information is conveyed through these meetings we have each week with the cooks that are much more geared towards providing the why, versus I think we talk very much just about logistics and making stuff happen. I feel very lucky in that, I came onto this job after, the restaurant had been open for 10 years. Several people have done my job before me, and so many of these relationships are already in place and are already very strong. So when I showed up my first day, you're kind of grandfathered into these things. And so, there have been some new relationships that have formed, and we can go into depth about, this kind of dance that you do when you meet someone and you're trying to figure out if the ideologies line up, and this process of getting in some product and trying it and not liking it or liking it. But I think to give a number, it's probably 5 hours a week, but it's just kind of a lot of texts and late night emails to these guys.
Yeah.
And I think it varies, and we'll have projects that require that research and require really digging into it because we don't have much previous knowledge. But most of my day is literally just moving vegetables from one place to another and moving the right vegetables and to the right places.
Yeah, great. So I know that that Blue Hill and the Stone Barns farmers have a weekly meeting where, Jason, you often come in and share something new on the farm or share what's available and abundant that week. I would love to hear first just a little bit more about what those meetings look like. How long are they? What do you talk about? But then, Jason, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about I think it's kind of clear what Blue Hill would get out of that presentation, but is it more of an exchange? And if so, Jason, what are you taking away from those conversations?
Absolutely. So I think your opinion on that is really important too. But from the farm perspective, what I've learned is, one of the biggest keys is that you don't want to grow something that you don't have a home for, whatever that home is. So essentially, you don't want to grow something that you don't think you can sell somewhere or you can find a good use for. So that's really important. So that's where, you have to start with communication. Being completely haphazard with things is not going to work in your favor. I really think even in a fresh market setting, and Tyler, you can speak to that if you agree, but even at a fresh market setting, you have to get to know your customer or have an idea of what's going to sell. You don't just want to show up, because things are perishable. So that's an important thing too. So the other part is to the meetings. I think the meetings are where so much advances because it's a short window, and we are very fortunate here to be on property together, so that meeting can be 20 to 30 minutes, whereas a lot of farmers maybe dropping off at restaurants are double parked and they're going to get a ticket or something like this. But I think if you take the idea of what we have here and you try to incorporate it on any farm in any possible way that is possible, anything, whether it's a Skype call or whether it's a phone call or an email. But the idea is that in those meetings, we can help share the story. And by us sharing the story is not just me getting words out, it's to create an understanding of what's going on because things change so rapidly on the farm. So our plan in the winter is a great thing, but the reality is always different. And the subtle differences play a big role, like Andrew was alluding to. We plan to grow, for 2 years we grow this great pak choi. It does perfectly, growing it in the same window every season. And then this season, to factors that have nothing to do with anything we can control, it starts to bolt quicker. So we have to act quicker. So that engagement in that meeting is a chance for us every week, or in as much capacity as we can, to put the pressure on there, to say that this is You want to eat seasonally, you want to eat, farm driven, this is the moment for it. It's not exactly the date that we planned. So for our perspective, it's so important for us to share as much detail as we can about what's going on and to also listen, because there's a lot of learning that happens in that meeting too. Because I can't, as a farmer, you're not always thinking about the 16 different ways you can cook something. And it's important to get the response from the customer. And in this, conversation about the restaurant, where there's so much creativity that can go on in there that can reach a lot of people. So that meeting is very much a give and take that I think is important.
And I think we often, not struggle, but have trouble getting to that final answer to these meetings. And I think often you are trying to not sell something, but to put some pressure on and get us to get on board with something. And I think we often struggle with these meetings just not really being a time for the cooks to learn, but to actually be useful.
Yeah.
Which I know we've talked about a lot, because I think you're always trying to get everyone's attention and to get an answer, can we go on kohlrabi, can we go on cabbage? And I think it's important that these meetings do not just become,
Right, it's important to keep it real, but also with that, samples. I mean, I think everybody kind of knows that, but the taste of things. If you grow the same variety, the same time of year, there's going to be similarities, but I think there's always something unique to the moment that somebody tastes something, to the season itself. So having that tool always, so we build that into our system, that we're going to grow things and we're going to have samples, even to people that we've been working with since the beginning, because that taste sparks an idea. It does make a difference. We know there's some things we've been growing the same variety for 10 years, but having the taste gets things to start rolling on the other side, the buyer side. So that's a really important thing from our perspective.
Great. So this next question's for you, Tyler. I know your farm is fairly established now, but when you were starting out, can you talk to us about what some of the first steps were for you in initiating and building relationships with restaurants to sell your product to?
Yeah. So restaurants have always been kind of a key part of our business. In the first year, we were really starting from scratch. Basically, the only real restaurant contact that we had was with Blue Hill, because I had been an apprentice here. That was before we were doing markets. It was before we were at Union Square. So it was much more a kind of like, cold calling sort of thing. I used to drive around the Hudson Valley a lot, giving out free samples, just like trying to initiate conversations with chefs about, what we could do, what they were looking for. And it was honestly really a struggle. The first year, I was mainly trying to focus on restaurants within the Hudson Valley as opposed to the city. And it was pretty tough to build up enough volume and enough sort of regular clients to like make it work as a significant part of the business. I think what really shifted for us was when we made the leap to the green market system. The first year we were at 82nd Street, we weren't at Union Square. Again, the only restaurant that we could actually get to pick up from us there was Blue Hill. But once we went to Union Square, it was like the game totally changed for us in our ability to make contacts with restaurants. I think part of it is, it's hard to get the attention of someone like Andrew. Blue Hill obviously has a lot of established relationships and a lot of connections, but even smaller restaurants in the city have like an insane range of options about who they can be buying from. There are all kinds of distributors and different services, and like a lot of farms that are at the market or do deliveries. So even being at the market, we have this kind of weekly FaceTime with all of these potential customers, but it's still, in a way, we're a sort of restricted vendor for these places. We don't do any deliveries because we don't have the capacity. So I think, now that we're at market, we have this opportunity to basically go off the strength of what we bring. A lot of it is about trying to initiate new contacts week to week. And over time, I think our relationship with Blue Hill informs our other restaurant relationships a lot, in that we've had 4 years now to kind of build up this relationship of mutual trust and open up communication. I'm definitely in contact with Andrew much more than any of the other regular buyers that we have, but I do sort of look to our relationship as sort of a model for the others. So, I'm trying to encourage our regular customers to come to the farm. to just spend a few minutes at market, like talking to me about what we do. Those few minutes of FaceTime are super valuable, just to get on their radar and and eventually build up enough trust that you can solicit like critical feedback, like what's working, what isn't working. That's often a big challenge for us.
So, Andrew, you're not just sourcing from Tyler and Jason, right? So talk to us a little bit about how you find farmers and how you start those new relationships when you do.
I think one of the bigger things for just the farms you work with is just being able to get it to our door. I am at the market every single morning, and so having all these different farms aggregated there is extremely helpful, and that really makes up the bulk of our purchasing is having farms that are going to go to the market. I can fill up my van and bring it here. And so there are some farms that we work with that do make deliveries, but they're very few and far between. And so I think our purchasing is kind of broken up into two categories. There's just the bulk stuff that we have that we use in the restaurant but are probably more anonymous, things that go into purees or juiced. And in that area, we have a lot more flexibility in choosing which farms we want to go to. And so at the market, it's kind of most often just what looks nicer, what is easier to get in bulk. And that there's not as much of a rhyme or reason for that. But I think the stuff that, when you come and eat and you're looking at the plate, that is the stuff that is often contracted in advance and we know is coming. And so those kind of things we try to limit to a small amount of farms just because most of these things are very high touch. They're either a new seed we're trying to work on or some kind of interesting idea we want to explore. And so these are things that require following up and require these conversations. And so just for everyone's sanity, we try to keep them limited to 4 or 5 farms that we know extremely well. And so I think they're farms that have their own benefits. And so we look to Tyler for a lot of these larger scale breeding projects we do. Or there's a farm up in Norwich, New York that has high tunnels, and so that allows us to push into the early and late part of the season. And so I think each of the farms that we work with in a lot of depth have their own kind of benefits. But again, I think many relationships that we have are kind of put into place, and so when I came into this job, you knew that you got spinach and fennel from that place because it was great, and we like to do baby kohlrabi from this farm. And so I think there's a little bit less, there's a lot of flexibility, but it tends to stay pretty consistent just because I think it works from a perspective of you go to the market and there's an expectation that they're going to have it for you, but also from your perspective, I'm sure it'd be really disconcerting to have a restaurant buying 30 pounds of spinach every single Friday, and then one week they just stop and you have no idea why. And so I think it benefits the relationship to have some consistency in that regard.
Got it. That's great. So I want to shift a little bit to talk kind of about some of the nuts and bolts of the relationships between farms and restaurants. So I'm hoping you guys can talk a little bit about what the contracts between the restaurant and the farms that you source from look like. What are you prepaying for? What can you contract for in advance? And what are you buying kind of on the spot week to week? And then I'm going to ask you guys about how that affects your business. But I'd love to hear first from your perspective, Andrew, about what that looks like.
I think we have a unique perspective in that we pay a sum of money in the beginning of the season and that Tyler will deduct from. So it's not necessarily a contract in terms of we're going to pay 400 pounds of kohlrabi at $3 a pound and here's $1,200. It's more of just a sum that Tyler will detract from. Most of our contracts are not prepays. They are just kind of handshake deals that, we are asking for 200 pieces of kohlrabi for this long and whoever. There are some, it's pretty case by case. There are some farms that do request prepays, and there are some farms that I think we're comfortable just having this trust and that we're going to pay for it and they're going to grow it. From my perspective as a buyer, I feel more comfortable in the latter of that just because, things change constantly, and unless it's a product that I think can be moved elsewhere, we just try to, take as much as possible.
So Tyler, I'm curious whether you're, how your business is set up with different restaurants affects how you think about your relationship with them or how you're able to plan for your season.
Yeah. So as Andrew said, we do a prepayment. It's kind of renewing on like a circular basis just whenever it runs out. That is very different from the experience that I've had with any other restaurant that we work with. We have some other clients at Union Square who buy like a significant volume from us, and we've discussed the idea of a prepayment model because it has so much value for us, both in terms of getting the capital up front, but also because it makes their buyer, their chef, just kind of continually interested in what you have. But nobody else has really bitten on it. I mean, it's pretty easy to like say it, but not that many chefs that I've worked with are really, people don't have like big chunks of money just sitting around. Most of the restaurants that we work with operate with slim margins and are, under a lot of pressure to kind of make their budget work. In terms of contracts, we're always pushing to kind of move things in that direction. But again, it's, I don't think I've ever really had like a real contract with a restaurant where there was, like something written, or even a prepayment other than with Blue Hill.
Yeah.
I think, if I can get a restaurant to like clearly state like, okay, at this time we're going to be wanting to buy like a bunch of green kabocha that's this size. That's like a really good lead for me to go off of. But often we don't really even have that. The truth is that it's pretty hard to solicit that kind of communication. We have a very special relationship with Blue Hill, but in general, I think many of the restaurants that we work with, even ones that buy from us like a large volume every week, we're one of many farms that they're just kind of picking and choosing from all the time. So we're just sort of like part of the menu. We're always trying to like facilitate these ways that the relationship can be more forward-looking. Let people know what we have. I think part of how we do that is by trying to provide some consistency. Like Andrew was saying, even before he had his position as like the purchaser for Blue Hill, it was kind of already established within the the culture of the kitchen here that we get spinach from this farm, we get fennel from this farm. I've kind of gradually tried to like push us into that sort of, we're known for a few particular things over time, and that has really been helpful to us.
That's great.
I think just to add something, and I'd love your opinion too on this, but I think something unique to Stone Barns' position with an established relationship with a really responsive customer is that other part of my position here that I was talking about with trialing and breeding and experimenting. I feel like that niche is a riskier niche in some ways, but it's also a really important one that here we're trying to say that everyone should think about in some way, even if it's just 5 seeds of a new radish to try just to see if you can differentiate yourself. Because what I've noticed in my years doing this here and elsewhere is just that, so somebody's known for fennel and somebody's known for spinach. But that doesn't mean that there's not room for other fennel and spinach, different times of the year, different sizes, all these kinds of things. And what I've noticed is that when you can get in the door with something, it opens up for other things. So if you can grow that really unique vegetable, if you can get that new variety of something, that can open up the door to build a relationship, because starting with the trust in that way can really help expand also. But there's challenges with that too. Which is where communication and collaboration really have to come in. So, we're talking about this, and you can hear the challenges that Tyler's mentioning. Where are the mass amounts of other customers that are as open to these ideas? I think that's something too we need to explore: is farmers growing more diverse items and consumers willing to accept new diverse items. Like that kind of expanding of what food is going to help both sides out a lot.
I'm curious if any of you have seen models of like almost like a restaurant CSA that kind of looks like this idea of, a prepay where you get what you get and you don't get upset on a weekly basis. And I'm just curious, I think we've experimented a little bit with that in the past, but I don't know, Tyler, if that's something that you've looked at or
thought
about.
In a way, that's sort of how I think of my relationship with Blue Hill is, it's like a CSA, and that we get all the money up front, and there's this kind of high level of mutual trust, which is supposed to be part of a CSA. We try to map things out as best we can at the beginning of the season, but sometimes things on the farm don't work, or something will shift on their menu, or something will turn out just not quite exactly what they were looking for. I think that for me, part of the value of working with restaurants is actually sort of similar to what you would get in a CSA, I imagine, in that you get to see sort of the same group of customers every week who are like using your stuff. And at Union Square, we sell to a high number of restaurants, but they're really only like 12 or 15 like really significant accounts. So people like Andrew, I see every single week, and we get FaceTime and have an opportunity to kind of elicit some feedback. I think, in an ideal world, it would be amazing if everyone was prepaying, but it's it's sort of hard to push people in that direction.
Mm-hmm. So this is a question for Jason and Tyler. So how do you guys think about the time that you spend doing this kind of work, communicating, talking to restaurants? I mean, is there a tension between that work and your farming work? And if so, how do you resolve that tension?
So I think over time I've come to understand that this sort of work, the communication with people like Andrew, is really like so crucial to what we do. Someone who goes into the market and is looking for carrots has like 50 different options available to them, and I think that more often than not, it comes down to some relationship that they have that's the basis of their choice. And I think that we're always trying to kind of work to secure our relationships with certain accounts. Yeah. Sort of lost my train of thought there.
I think that's true. First, I'll say I'm really thankful for mobile devices.
Yeah.
Because the ability to communicate, I think this is a common thread for all farmers. Like every movement you make, you're accounting for in some way. Every time you walk, to the bin to drop something off, like this movement towards more and more efficiency. How can I harvest and move in the same motion so that everything can be fluid and efficient? It's the same thing with writing emails. If you have to run back to your shed, run down the hill, up the hill to answer these things, you miss things. So really having the mobile communication is really important, because what I've noticed is that there's no 100% predictability on our side, and there's no 100% predictability on the restaurant side either. I spend a lot of time putting together detailed harvest lists with notes, and as you build a relationship, the notes are going to reflect that. So with different restaurant or different outlets we have, the notes and explanation of that is going to be different because of the understanding of that vegetable and what it means. So we have a very unique language that just develops because of exactly understanding what they want, what we're producing. So something as simple as small, medium, and large, that takes a lot of description. It's not that simple, because there's this very specific use on the other end. So a lot of time is spent on communication, but that's where, building that into the system, that has to be there. So, when we built our farm system to increase our communication, we also increased, the people that were on the ground that knew what was going on. So people like Nick and Daniel here at the center who can run the ship while a lot of communication is going on, so that somebody isn't stepping off and, communicate. So it's not a surprise that somebody's communicating. It's built into the system. Someone is going to need to communicate because this stuff needs to go somewhere. So that's a really valuable lesson. But also, trying to be as organized as possible is the key, so that all that language is already there and it's just a matter of a quick response.
I would also say, just in terms of like time management and how much attention I'm spending communicating with buyers and chefs, there's definitely a wide range of personalities that we work with in the chefs that buy from us. And the fact of the matter is I do have to sometimes put a limit on how much communication I can do with some particularly high maintenance accounts.
He's not looking at you.
Not me.
Yeah, I'm not.
He is.
No, well,
but
I
he's
am
not.
looking at Andrew because it is a high maintenance account, but they also kind of back it up. And we frequently will have relationships where someone is like texting me at midnight about celery or something, but then they aren't really buying anything and they don't really pay their bills, so then I kind of blow them off. But someone like Andrew can text or email anytime.
Good to know.
Yeah.
So I'm going to build on that a little bit, Tyler. So I wanted to ask you what the biggest challenge was of working with world-class restaurants. We'll keep it general. I won't look at you, Andrew. But like, what are the challenges of selling to a restaurant that sets just such a high bar for quality?
Yeah, I think in the end, it all comes down to communication. I think that there are a couple parts to that. One is, like I was saying, just trying to get people's attention, trying to find a way to solicit critical feedback. Like Andrew said, it's a frequent thing for us where we'll have a restaurant buy like a really nice volume of something one week and then not again after that. And it's often very mysterious to us why that is. I think the notion of quality is fairly subjective in the marketplace, in the sense that many of the chefs that we're working with have a very specific idea of what they want before they come to us. So it's not necessarily like, we could grow like a perfectly straight, like super sweet carrot, but that might not be what they're looking for their menu. They might be doing like a more savory dish, and those little differences are often unknown to us. I think that one of the best things that we can do is try to really engage with chefs about what's actually happening on their menu. I think a lot of farmers have the idea that they can go to the market and just put out their stuff and make it look as beautiful as possible. And a lot of chefs will walk by and just think like, oh, I can't not have that cabbage. But they often, have no need for cabbage, or they already have like a cabbage supplier. I think Andrew could speak to this more, but they usually enter the market with the thought like, okay, I need like blueberries, I need spinach that's like this big, I need like white carrots that are like a pencil. I think the big challenge in working with really high-end places is figuring out what those things are and finding out in advance what those things are, because often, people aren't really willing to say.
One thing I think, let's not forget that most people, like you're saying, right, to tell me if this is further down the road of what you're talking about, like most people have preconceived notions of what they want. Look, that's how the supermarket model exists. That's how, we talk about it all the time here, the farmer's market model, even everybody's cherry picking what they want. And nobody seems to want to go in the extreme and go into like a full global CSA where we're all just eating what's coming out, right? So we're struggling right now. This is not a moment of everything working. This is all about a moment that's not totally working, and there's some glimmers of hope. But this idea that we cherry pick some things and not others is a big, challenge. So how do you get, how do the consumers change? When we're growing stuff and sitting here thinking about how obvious it is, but it's not. How do we get people to change their desires for food? How do we get people to get excited about stuff at the market that is important for diversity of crops, for a crop rotation? I mean, it's hard. It's hard to get people to even pronounce celeriac. Like these things, they take time. So it has to be creative, and it's definitely a challenge. I think that's part of it.
So how do we do that? So Jason and Andrew, can you guys talk a little bit about the concept of like failure and how the Blue Hill Stone Barns, this conversation you're in, like what happens when a crop, we have too much of something or something doesn't come up the way we want it to, and talk about Speaking of creativity, talk to us about that.
We're in the midst of that.
What's going on?
Always,
yeah. I said it at our last session, but I think we're at the advantage here of having many tools to move product that is either in excess or is not what we expected. And so this season, kohlrabi, it got frosted, and so we had contracted for 300, 400 pieces that we do this one dish with, and because of the frost, we're not able to use this kohlrabi for that dish. And then a conversation happens, and it's like, okay, well, what can we do with that? And we're very lucky to have a cafe here and to have a pretty large business doing large events like this. And so when you all have dinner tonight, you're gonna have kohlrabi soup. I can guarantee that. And we also have several buckets of kohlrabi kraut upstairs. And so we have the option of moving these products into places that we did not expect. So that's kind of often where it goes. And then we're now talking about, okay, well, now this kohlrabi is not what we expected. We're having to go to a different farm to buy what we had liked to use. is there a difference in price in the seconds kohlrabi? And that's a question just because it's still feeding people, it's still super delicious, it's just not exactly what people wanted. And that's what we're figuring out. And so I think, we're lucky to have a system in place that failure doesn't really exist. There's very, very, very few things that go into compost or go into pig bin. We can always find something, and we're doing a dish with celery root that is taking some of the ones that got left in the fields and drying it down and rehydrating it and whatever. So it's much more processed and allows us to use it. But I don't know. I mean, what's your perspective on that?
To go a little further on that, I think those are great examples. This year, to give something tangible, this year was backwards in so many ways. So we have our systems down. We know the temperatures that we're looking for, and we're feeling confident about some crops staying in through those deep frosts, and some of them that we know have to come out before that. So the week's happening, the team's getting together, all our plans adjust because the weather just decided to drop down below 20 degrees for the first time in the season. So we make our plans, we pick our crops, and we harvest everything. Now we go in and have this conversation with the restaurant, and the request is actually, carrots are so much better when they get really cold. But what we know from our experience is in this climate, it gets too cold to leave carrots to overwinter. You leave them to overwinter, they're going to crack, they're going to rot from the inside. We can't grow them straight through the winter. And when the temperatures are going to drop below 20 degrees, that's our trigger that we need to get them out. Because I think that one's an important one in this too. So again, obviously, very special circumstance we're talking about, but we're trying to, use this lab that we have as a way to kind of figure out what maybe the future can look like of relationships between restaurants and farms. So I know what I'm saying is very unique and very special to hear, but it's something that I think there are lessons from that everybody can try to incorporate in their relationships with their consumers, their customers. So these guys, of course, want to leave the carrots in. We want to get all the carrots out. We think we should leave in all the kohlrabi and all the celeriac because everything for the last couple of years has always worked this way. We know these things are cold tolerant, the cabbages, all this stuff. So the night happens, a little bit before, we take out, the agreement is they would like us to experiment with some of these carrots. So then the question is, well, okay, that's great. I would love, we would love for that to happen, but not at the risk of production. Like, we're not going to sacrifice the farm. Nobody here is going to sacrifice their farm for a chance that that's going to work out, right? So we take the 4,000 pounds and divide it, and then we pick a number that makes sense. And the idea in this unique way is, the request is that we'd like to buy the carrots but keep them in the ground, right? So if they die, they die. But we'd like to buy the carrots and keep them in the ground. Not 4,000 pounds, a small percentage of that, but one that can be of benefit to the customer and one that can be an experiment and a lesson to both parties. So we take everything we can out, we get it into storage, things look great, we're really happy with it, and then this percentage that is now in this kind of interesting limbo that's paid for but is in a risky situation is now kind of shared. That's a unique thing. On the other end of that, it got too cold for the kohlrabi and too cold for the celeriac, a lot of it that had never happened to us like this before. And so when we come back and things kind of revive, we notice that, my heart drops, all of our heart drops, because we see that there's something that doesn't look like it's going to recover. And so now we're in a really bad situation because with those crops, there was no discussion, there was no payment, there was no plan in that situation. Now that's what are we going to do with it? So it's these kind of unique ways to then we bring that to the table and go through discussion, and try to get to another place, which in respect to you guys did an incredible job of creating such delicious results from that stuff that wasn't completely dead, but now we know that when you wanted it for 6 months storage, 5 months storage, it's only going to last for 2 months. So everything has to shift. And it turned out the carrots were actually okay and they tasted amazing, which is unfortunate in some ways because it was such a risk, but it was interesting to learn that we could push things a little bit further. Not that we would do 4,000 pounds next year, but that there's lessons in this kind of shared responsibility, which I think we need more of, more shared responsibility in kind of exploring what food is.
Yeah. How about you, Tyler? Are you a perfect farmer, or do you sometimes have crops that turn out?
I am a perfect farmer.
Okay, then no more questions. No,
Yeah,
just kidding.
we can sometimes get Andrew to take things that are like a little bit damaged or wouldn't otherwise be marketable. But in general, I think the relationships that we have with most of our restaurant customers are sort of like in a baby steps point in that spectrum. I think, like a lot of farmers, the way that I try to cover my bases have to do with, growing things where we can get secondary harvests, like in the spring. We plant a ton of baby fennel, and then once it bolts, we market the flowers. If we have cilantro that bolts, we harvest the green coriander, things like that. And sometimes like we work with some wholesalers, and I remember one time we did a big order of baby fennel, and after like many conversations, we convinced them to take them with the roots on because it was just easier for us. But I think, what you guys are talking about is sort of like the ideal. This idea of whatever the farm does, the restaurant will find a way to work with it. And I think that we are not there yet with most of our restaurant accounts, but I think that sort of MO is in the air, definitely. And I think we're trying to push our relationships in that direction.
And I think if more restaurants were to contract, you would have more of these kind of explorations, just because we're not contracted for these things, but we might as well be, just because it's grown here and we're going to take it. And so it's that necessity that is causing the kitchen to look to different ways to cook celery root. I think if more restaurants were to have commitments to farms, they would take all these different things because they had to, or at the loss of money.
It's kind of interesting because it's kind of like a shared insurance. Because with some of these crops, on the discount that might come out of that, we're definitely not going to make what we thought we were going to make. We're going to lose some of it, right? It's not all glorious. So, but can we get to a lower loss point? Because that's helpful. That's the insurance that doesn't exist anywhere for anybody, is can you salvage something from it? And sometimes you can't, but when you can, to have some backing on the other end is really important.
Do you guys think that model of kind of sharing the risk between the restaurant and the farmer only works for high-end, world-class restaurants, or could that work with other kinds of restaurants or even fast casual restaurants? Like, how big could this idea be?
I think it's less of size, but just more of putting emphasis on having the capacity to do these things. Almost all these seconds and waste products just require more work to make edible or make delicious. And so here, I think we put a premium on being able to work with these things, and instead of having restaurants that have their cooks like dice perfect squares or something, we have cooks peeling down kale stems or something like that. And so it's an intention to make these things happen, and I think that's probably not at the top of most restaurants' lists, is to figure out how to use these wasted products, just because it's sometimes at odds of having an expensive restaurant. And so you don't want to go into an expensive restaurant and have what is considered to be a second or lower product. And so I think there's ways of making these seconds work in terms of being stock vegetables or being able to market them in ways that chefs could get behind. But I'm really, because like at the market myself, it's you'll see seconds tomatoes and other things, and we are less excited about those things just because we already are trying to struggle through these different things, and it's hard to take more onto your plate. And again, we are at this luxury of having people to help, whereas most restaurants are understaffed and have their nose to the wall against budgets. So
Makes sense.
I think for us, the idea of finding relationships with chefs who are willing to take seconds is one thing, but that's just like beyond where we are in the marketplace. We're working on trying to get people to take our firsts usually. But to the question of whether you can only do that kind of stuff with really high-end places, I feel like that isn't true. I mean, we definitely have relationships with a number of very small restaurants who don't have nearly the staff or the resources of like a Blue Hill at Stone Barns, who still will come to us every week and just buy whatever we have. And sometimes things aren't in perfect shape, or sometimes it's not something that really like fits with what they're doing on their menu. But we just have a relationship that's been built up over time such that they are willing to conform whatever they're doing to what we're offering that week. And I feel like that kind of thing is much more the model for smaller places. I mean, in as much as a place like Blue Hill has like massive resources, they also, like a big restaurant, a big operation, often those restaurants have the least flexibility in terms of what they can do and how much they can improvise based on what you have that week.
Thanks. Okay, let's open this up for questions. Wake up. Yeah, no, I know you guys must have some questions for these guys, so we'd love to hear them.
I think probably actually with Tyler and Jason, and then that's all me, but could you guys just talk more about that communication of availability and, I guess I might say, seasonality? So I feel like the feedback I get a lot is like, can you give me like 2, 3 weeks, 4 weeks lead time on when you're gonna have your, white carrots ready, or when that baby tunnel's gonna be ready.
Okay.
And I find that's very challenging if you're growing such a diversity of crops, over like, if you have like 50, 75 varieties available, communicating each of those varieties and what's coming, what's on deck. How does that work for you, the farmers and the buyer?
So for the folks on the live stream, the question was, how do you communicate about what's going to be available coming down the pike, especially when you're growing multiple things and there's complexity in that. So you're planning ahead, days ahead, weeks ahead. How do you manage that?
So I'm sending out a price list twice a week in advance of each of our days at Union Square. When I'm really like on my game, I'll include a section in the price list that's kind of like what's coming up, in the coming weeks. And I find that sometimes that can be helpful. But, another thing that I find is that often chefs aren't even really reading the price list, or they just look for like one thing that they want. They aren't really looking at everything that's there. Another thing that we've tried, which is basically what we do with Blue Hill, is, we'll take a lot of time like in the winter and really try to plan ahead, let someone know like everything you're doing so they know what to expect. But I think the challenge there is that can actually be like an overwhelming amount of information for a restaurant to see your whole crop plan and also like an overwhelming level of expectation in terms of like how much they might be buying from you. I think that the only thing that I've found that really consistently works in that regard for us is like actual FaceTime to just, if I have a particular chef in mind for a particular item, really just pull them aside and say like, starting in like 2 or 3 weeks, we're going to be harvesting like our artichokes. And I think that they would like really work for you for this reason. I think something that I've learned since, being at the market, working with restaurants, is that the chefs that we work with are often like more exhausted and frazzled than the farmers that are there. And have like a very limited attention span and are often like under intense pressure to like make whatever they're doing work. So it's sort of hard to get them in like a mode of communication where they're willing to do this like improvisation that we imagine they're doing at the market. I think, it's just relationships.
I think also a large percentage of the restaurant buyers that are at the market are not really the folks making the choices. I think a lot of these people are just kind of porters who are given lists of things to get, and if you agree or not. But I think there are certain restaurants that I think the purchasers have more leeway in terms of, what they're going to get, or buying samples or something just to see what's coming up. But I would imagine it's much harder for a lot of restaurants if the person that is buying and picking up the stuff doesn't really understand what you're talking about or how that might really work for the restaurant.
Yeah, that was a real challenge for us when we were mainly doing deliveries to restaurants, because then you often don't get to really interact with the cook at all, especially doing deliveries in the city. Sometimes restaurants will have like a receiver person who doesn't like really know much about what's going on, and even if a chef does come out to talk to you, you're like parked illegally, so you can't really stay for very long. I think that's something that's been really good for us about being at market. Even though often the people who come to market aren't like the executive chef or the CDC or something. Often it's someone like Andrew who like does really know what's going on and is really involved and can, you can inform them what's happening and they'll sort of speak to the larger organization.
Sort of related to that, this is a question from one of our live stream viewers. Do you have additional suggestions if you're not able to be interacting with chefs at the market? Do you have additional suggestions for cultivating those relationships?
So the question was, if you're not at the market, what strategies do you use to communicate to chefs you're selling to?
I feel like a tool that has become really useful for me is Instagram for a lot of chefs and a lot of restaurants and farms, just because, and maybe probably not for every single restaurant, but I think that's a really good way of having almost like a price list. I think a lot of the farms we work with will post photos of what they're going to be harvesting, and I could only imagine that's going to spur some kind of interest as well.
Yeah, I mean, I know some farms who are mainly catering to restaurants, like exclusively via a delivery model, who don't do any markets, and I think that it's actually basically the same thing. Like, the way that they've made that work is by going to the restaurants and putting in a lot of face time, you know, cold calling people by bringing like cases of free samples and like following up with them a lot. I think that it would be very hard to build up a significant clientele of restaurants just by sending out a list and expecting that people are just going to start ordering from you, unless you have like the most beautiful list in the world. Yeah, I think there's really no way around like establishing those relationships face to face.
Question here.
Yeah, you guys talked about relationships a lot, but kind of more specifically, and from the buyer, the chef's perspective, what are the things that you value when you're looking for somebody to partnership with the farm in those relationships? What are the things that are like, this is great, or this guy's driving me nuts?
From which side were you? Both sides?
Well, more just for me, more from the chef side.
So the question was, from the chef's perspective, what do you look for in a farmer in terms of having a good relationship with them versus determining whether they're going to be annoying and high maintenance?
I think just in general, the biggest question of, you know, will we put this in the menu is how often can we get it? You know, there are some farms in the market that are there once a week or are at different markets throughout the city that would require going, you know, to the Upper West Side. I think having a farm that is offering you consistent products that you can get twice a week, 3 times a week, that is delicious. It doesn't even have to be a new product, as long as you can get it consistently. I think that's kind of the first step. In terms of personality, I think many of these relationships are just based on, you know, knowing each other and just trusting. And I think you get a read pretty quickly if it's a farm that is going to match up with the restaurant's ideology. And, you know, there are some farms that we just don't buy from just because, you know, they're nice people, but I don't think the things that they produce or the way they produce it is really in line with our mindset at the restaurant. But I mean, these things happen, you know, very naturally, and there have been some farms that we work with that their market manager switches over, and the new person is great, and they're way more you know, they communicate much better, they're much nicer, they respond to your texts, and I think that just that alone can push you towards being a farm you're going to buy from.
I think it's also important to hear what you want. So if you're on the chef side, I mean, not being afraid to ask 10 farms, you know, if you don't get a response from one, but like asking 10 farms for something, like going over into that relationship place before a real relationship is established, if that makes sense. Like, start small on all fronts. You know, thinking about it, you can't just set out to cultivate restaurant relationships. You know, you can't always figure that out depending on where you are. There's gonna be so many circumstances. So from the farm perspective, it's like, establish, you know, feel it out, establish the market. If you're not gonna get a big restaurant relationship right away, maybe that's not the model to set forward with. Maybe it's something else. Maybe you have to go to a CSA model that your community in your area is going to get on board with just to get to that place. So you're serving a market, and now you can take some extras and you take them down and start showcasing to restaurants. We've seen success with that, you know, former apprentices and such, like building in that way. You got to feel out the market first, because also, like Tyler said, he didn't get into Union Square right away. So, you know, that's not an option. So I think it's really important to always observe the resources and figure it out and find creative ways to grow incrementally instead of like all at once.
I think this is kind of going back to the question of like how to initiate relationships with restaurants if you don't have like a Union Square. I mean, so we do go to Union Square, but we also work with a number of distributors that cater specifically to restaurants. And, you know, going forward, I think that's probably the model that we would choose to embrace, as opposed to, you know, trying to establish, you know, cold call new relationships with restaurants who aren't shopping at the market, like even other restaurants in other parts of the city that don't go to Union Square. And I feel like if you're just starting out, it actually could make a lot of sense to basically hire out the business of like making these restaurant contacts. Like consider working with a distributor. I think it could be a lot easier than just starting totally from scratch.
Can you speak to developing relationships with livestock farmers? Because when small farmers or beginning farmers are raising livestock, there's a lot more difficulty in pivoting with the needs of a restaurant.
Great. So the question was, can you speak to relationships with livestock farmers in particular?
I actually don't handle much of the livestock meat, but I know that most of our meat schedule is planned out 8-12 months in advance. And so we like with the farms, we work with a very small amount of producers. And we have folks that do a few things very well. So we have someone who gives us pheasants and quail, and that's in a 3-month period in the fall. And we have someone who does pigs for us, in June and July. And so it's this very segmented thing that we have folks that do things very well and that we look for certain things, as well as farms that we are getting 2 pigs a week, every single week from. So I can't speak personally in terms of how to build those things. I've never done it, but I know it definitely shares a similar model as with the produce, except I would guess it's a little bit less fluid and changing month to month.
Is there any degree of cooperation between the growers at a market like Union Square so that there's a full offering of stuff and not repetition and competition and things like that?
That's a great question. The question was, is there cooperation amongst the growers at the market to offer a full offering to chefs?
Yeah, I would say there definitely is, in the sense that I know all of the veg growers at Union Square are attentive to what everyone else has, especially if you're working with restaurants. You kind of gradually get a sense of what the other farms are known for specifically in their product. We have some good friends who are at market with us on Fridays who are really known for their chicories. So, for us, having them there the same day as us, whether or not we ever actually have a conversation about it, it means that we're not going to be growing a lot of fancy chicories and bringing it that day. A, because they're our friends, and B, because they already sort of have it locked down. I mean, I think it would be hard for us to sort of detract that business. There's also, on the side of market management, I don't think this is specific to Green Market, but there is kind of an active effort by the market managers to sort of balance the product that's there and keep track of what people are doing. As far as really direct cooperation between the growers, pre-planning what we're going to grow, I actually haven't seen that happen. It's all sort of de facto.
Interesting idea.
With minimum wage going up in the city to $13, I think, this January, and then $15 next. From just the people in the restaurant industry I've talked to, expect sort of a larger kind of shakeup within the industry itself. And, those chefs that I've talked to, I'm like, well, what do you really do about that? And they're like, well, you gotta cut food costs and you gotta go somewhere, or you charge more for the food, which people don't really want to do. So with organic food becoming more ubiquitous, larger players coming into the market, they can really provide much lower cost organic food. That there's, of course, all this pressure to really cut costs. So I guess I'm just wondering maybe if you agree with that, there is sort of a larger shakeup going to happen, and if so, what do you do?
So the question was about how the increases in minimum wage might affect both the restaurant business and the farmer's business as people adjust to higher labor costs. You guys have thoughts on that?
Yeah.
If I could just add one thing first. People have been trying to cut food costs and doing it successfully consistently forever. That's what we're fighting against. So we're already there. We're all already there. The bump that organic gave for a while with that certification was really valuable for that moment. But with the way organic, as you mentioned, has been diluted, it's also, again, it's the same thing. It's, you're fighting against really cheap food. I think you got to find a way to differentiate yourself. You can't get stuck on what market you want. You got to find a market that appreciates what you're doing. And if we get into that game of cutting our own prices for everything so low that you push yourself out of already an almost insurmountable margin business, then there's not going to be any farmers left. So it's a very sensitive thing, but it's something where I think there is this divergence. We're here talking at this conference very much about agroecology and trying to find a way to establish your practices with such an ethic that somebody can value the work that you're doing, whether that's a community or whether that is a certain amount of restaurants. And the last part is, I'd say, with all the restaurants that are coming out that are doing much cheaper organic food options, which I think is kind of a net positive for the world, there are a lot of those popping up. That's a big investment sector. But there's also, it seems to be more and more restaurants popping up that want to have some relationship with direct to a farmer, some relationship to things that go beyond just organic from a distribution truck. So there's challenges there, but I think there's two things happening at the same time. It is a segment, I think. I don't know what you guys think.
Yeah, I think the minimum wage increase in the city is potentially going to be a really big deal for like small scale farms marketing to restaurants. It's something that I hear a lot of our restaurant buyers and other farms of the market talking about like all the time. Even over the last 2 seasons, I feel like I've felt a lot of the restaurants that we work with in the city really start to tighten their belts, and it's been in sort of subtle ways. Like we do like mixed cherry tomatoes, and accounts that last year would buy like 6 flats a week and put it in a bunch of different dishes. Now they just buy 1 flat a week and use it for some like really specialty purpose because we're on the higher end price-wise for something like that. I think, actually, to that point, we've also seen a number of restaurants restaurants totally leave the market or close down, which is really sort of alarming for the future. Places that are really established, like Franny's. I think for us, I still feel like long term, I want to keep restaurants as like a key component of the farm and of our business. And I feel like the way that we're trying to do that is by like really building relationships, which speaks to what Jay was saying, so that there's value in working with us that goes beyond price. But as time goes on, we're also just working on increasing the efficiency of our production so that we can remain price competitive. And I don't really know what else to do other than that.
Great.
The way that many chefs are always wanting to be innovative and seeking the next new product, do you get, other than Blue Hill, do you get a lot of chefs approaching you asking to experiment with new things to run trial? And how do you do that?
So the question was, with chefs always seeking the next new thing, do you get a lot of other restaurants and chefs besides Blue Hill approaching you to trial something new or grow something new?
I get some, but it's fewer than you would think. Pretty much any time someone approaches me saying they want us to grow something, we will do it. We're excited to do it because it's, if nothing else, just like a lead with that client. I wish that more chefs did that regularly. Sometimes I try to initiate conversations with chefs in the winter where I ask them to look through seed catalogs to see, what looks interesting to them, or think about, what they want to be getting that isn't present in the marketplace. We handle it basically by doing it. We'll grow whatever you want.
Good question. Other questions?
This kind of circles back to the previous question, but how do you guys set your prices? Like, how does that process work, especially, like you were saying, sometimes it'll take 300 to 400 kohlrabi's or something that's, borderline wholesale quantities there. Are you paying a wholesale price? When do you talk about price? Is it when you're in the off season, when you're planning menus so far in advance? Like, when does price get discussed, and how is it done? Like, are you guys analyzing the costs and basing, like, from the farmer's perspective or from the restaurant's perspective? Like, how are you going about setting prices so it works for both
So the question is, how do you set prices? Like, what are the factors that go into determining either a wholesale cost or sort of a retail cost of your product? And how do you guys think about, restaurant think about that as well?
I think it's at Stone Barns, we kind of, I've never haggled with a farm for pricing, just because I think we trust you guys that you are, A, not making a lot of money off this, but B, you're doing what you think is fair, what was going to reflect, your labor and all these different things. And I think all of us at the restaurant feel uncomfortable asking a farm to make less money off of the same product. And so this is probably a unique perspective from a restaurant, but again, I've never asked, a farm to lower their prices. In talking about some of these seconds, that is a conversation that we have. But I think, we think about pricing sometimes in terms of winter planning, and so there are certain things that, despite not having a formal menu, we like to have a consistent amount of each week, and so that's often the case with different baby vegetables. We contract with a farm to have, 300 Hakurei turnips at a quarter size, and with that information, this farm can plant at that density rather than taking, what would be a tennis ball size Hakurei turnip. And so in having these conversations of planning, a farm can adjust their practices, and we can save some money off that just because, they're not losing the space of doing that. So yeah.
I think for us, it's sort of two things. One is we look at a lot of reference points, what other farms in the market are charging. I look at other price lists all the time, not just for farms, but for distributors. Sometimes, Andrew will be kind enough to share some of his price lists with me. And I think if you have even, one good friend at a restaurant, they can show you so much information about pricing in the emails that they get every week that is sort of inaccessible for most farms otherwise. I think the other thing, we do kind of a combination of models ranging from resale or retail to restaurants to like baby wholesale, and then some like high volume wholesale. So we're working with a range of different pricing models for pretty much everything that we grow. Since we've taken that approach, I think the way that I'm sort of thinking about things now is very much about like the average price that we're selling things for per crop. And that's really the number that I'm imagining when I'm thinking about, what our expenses are. Does this really, work for us? I'm not super scientific in tracking like on-farm expenses. I've never done like a Richard Wiswall style, like track the labor for every single crop sort of calculation. But, you get kind of a rough sense as a grower, what takes the most labor, what you spend the most time on, and what you can sell things for.
Well, how do you as a farmer grapple with, if you're looking at a list from a different farm and it's much lower than what you could sell it as, how do you, adjust to that?
I mean, sometimes we do and sometimes we don't. As an example, I don't know. I mean, usually we can't adjust our pricing that much. I mean, I look to what other people do. At being a market farm, often at market, we'll offer like deals at the end of the day, stuff like that. Or if we have like a really unusual volume of something, we'll run a 2-for-1 or, something like that. But yeah, I mean, I look at some of the prices that other farms or distributors offer, and I, even without really sitting down to do the math, I just know like we couldn't charge that and still make it work. So I would say Blue Hill is among a fairly small number of restaurants that we work with that are not very sensitive to price. It's usually not a very big part of the conversation. Most of the other restaurants that we work with, it's a major factor in terms of their ability to work with us. I think looking to wholesale pricing is really a valuable thing because often small farms are really only thinking about their retail pricing, but you need to be offering like some kind of a discount for a restaurant to be buying even like a modest volume from you.
Great. Other questions?
We've gotten into this a couple of times, but I know you mentioned Tyler, and maybe Jason and Andrew has something to add, but Like the first year you were going out canvassing restaurants and it was really tough. But did any of those relationships, were any of them successful? Or any of them are still in place now? Or do, like, you keep mentioning the distributors and the wholesale, are you shifting more towards that just because it's easy, it's predictable, it's steady?
So the question was, I think, for Tyler, when you went out and found the restaurants by canvassing them, are those relationships still intact, or have you moved to more of a wholesale model?
I don't really have any of those relationships from the first year still, except for Blue Hill. But the main reason is not that they didn't work out. It's that I kind of made a decision after the first year that I was just spending too much time doing deliveries. So I basically ended relationships with a whole category of restaurants that we could only access through delivery. As you know, as we move forward, and we're still, direct marketing to restaurants is the bulk of our business, but we are working with some distributors. I don't ever really envision that we'll go just distributors, just wholesale. I think those two things kind of complement each other. It typically nowadays for us has to do with what our production capacity is for a certain thing. So like we can grow way more carrots now than we can possibly sell at market, even with all of our restaurant accounts. So it just sort of makes sense for us to be, marketing that in some other way. The list of products that we give to our wholesale buyers is much shorter than what we bring to market, because most of the things we grow are still very small quantities.
How important, Tyler, would you say getting that first restaurant client is to getting more restaurant clients?
Really important. Yeah, I think, this speaks to what a shift it was going into green market in terms of our success marketing to restaurants. It wasn't just that we had this sort of venue where all of these chefs were going. It was also that suddenly we had a place among all of these very established farms. So just being at the market sort of lends you a level of credibility. And I think that's a big deal, especially when you're trying to attract new accounts. We've worked with Blue Hill since the first year I had the farm, not because of necessarily any merit of what we were doing that year, but because that was a relationship that already existed, and having that account was helpful in getting other accounts, not because I was broadcasting it, because many of the buyers that we worked with were aware that I had been through this program and sort of knew what the nature of that was. I think if you're really starting from scratch, you're totally an unknown, that is probably very, very hard. I feel like you need to, find some way to get a little credibility.
Many restaurants like to advertise the fact that they are buying from specific farms. From the farmer's place in the market, how important is not saturating their local restaurant market, not trying to make their product more exclusive, not selling to every restaurant in the area?
So, great question. So the question was, a lot of restaurants are starting to sort of advertise the farmers that they work with, and how important is exclusivity to the restaurant, and also, from the farmer's perspective, to kind of, I guess, keep the brand intact for the farmer?
I think it's kind of at odds of the philosophy of our restaurant here, is because I think every restaurant's very competitive, and our boss Dan is probably the most competitive person in the entire world. And when there's something amazing at the market, there is that instinct of let's buy it all. But I think in a lot of these different things we're working with, the end goal is not just to have it be this niche thing that we have in Terrytown. It's actually to have it permeate the marketplace. And so I don't really know. It's in the culture of this restaurant to talk about, Tyler growing something or the chicories at the market along with everything that's going on here. We don't, some restaurants have back at the menu, it lists the farms that they buy from. We don't have that here. But I do think it's important, less from an exclusivity perspective, but to still tell these stories. And I think that might be something that is more important here, just because the menu and the whole meal is very narrative based, and the bulk of that narrative is made up of these stories that, of Stone Barn's apprentice who opened up their own farm, now he grows the best carrots to the market, and that kind of thing. I'm not sure other restaurants. I think most restaurants, to have it on their menu and have it be a staple, it needs to be available in a lot of bulk. And I would imagine that something that's exclusive is also probably not something that they can have in bulk. But I'm not sure.
I think for us, in terms of making decisions about what restaurants we work with, there's really no exclusivity is not a factor for us. We'll work with anyone who will talk to us, and we sell to some really high-end places and some places that are like really casual, totally different ethos from the buyers. But I don't think that kind of attitude would actually benefit us very much, and B, like, we're not in a position to turn away any business, like, ever.
How do you feel, Tyler, about when people put Alewife Farm on the menu? Like, good thing, like just good marketing, or do you feel like, oh, they're using my brand, or I don't know?
Yeah, I think it's a good thing for us. I mean, when chefs, will like tag us in a photo or something, I feel like it does potentially facilitate new restaurant contacts with other chefs who, see it. In terms of, if our name is on a menu and a lot of like non-restaurant buyers see it, I'm not sure that does very much for us, but I feel fine about it. I mean, I think it's nice that they're promoting that they buy locally.
We all get really excited when we see your name on a menu or in an Instagram post.
That's nice.
I know. I think it's important. It's like, okay, he's making it work in some way, and somebody's respecting that. The story is such an important part of this. It doesn't seem economical. It doesn't seem like it's going to play a role, but it is so important to making this work. And I don't think there is a model for how that's going to work, but differentiating and relationships are going to have to push this thing forward. This conversation is not about like, look how easy it is. This conversation is about like, here's how some things are sort of working.
I feel like if you look at the farms that have been at the market for a really long time, they have made their business off of being good at a very small amount of things, and so that in of itself becomes the marketing. There's a woman who grows great potatoes, and there's the chicory farm, and there's a farm that grows great Asian greens. And I think you get to that point where you have that recognition of, oh, Rick grows awesome potatoes, and that becomes its own best marketing as well.
So I encountered a few restaurants that in my area, we have a lot of restaurants that are high-end and that have relationship with small farms. So they're very the Cisco type of way of vegetable, dealing with vegetables, how they come packaged specifically and having things pre-prepared. So they've been interested in working with us, but they just can't, we haven't quite gotten to figuring out what are even just a few things to offer them that they're going to be able to make that transition without feeling like it's a huge burden for them to change how they're working in the kitchen. Like, are there some kind of obvious things that farms could start with to kind of get an entrance point? I like the mixed greens. The one chef is like, no, it's always too dirty. In the past, I got it from another farm. It was always too dirty. It's like, So are there a few things that make sense to start with?
Okay. So the question was for restaurants that don't typically source from local farms or smaller farms, what are some good products that you might try to use as an entry point for just getting them started?
And I would think to talk to them and, out of the entire Cisco list that they buy from, what are the things that they want to have better quality of? And, if it's carrots, for example, to sell the carrots in the same size bag so their purchaser doesn't have to, in their head think, oh, this farm's selling it by the bushel, but we get it per pound from Cisco. How does that work? And I think just having the same units and make it very, very clear how to make this work is helpful. There is a purveyor that sells everything in bushels, and every single time I look at that, I have to think in my head, like, what is the volume of a bushel and what does that translate? And that's just not something that I think most people in their job want to do. And I think things like, clean salad mixes, and, I know less farms do this, but a lot of purveyors are getting into the business of having, local produce that is peeled and cubed already. We don't do that here, but I would imagine that is something that's attractive. And so having a higher quality option of a similar format would be helpful.
Also, we've found that a way we've been able to enter in with other restaurant relationships has been, figuring out something on their menu that we could fit into, right? So it's not going to be your whole, again, it just doesn't exist sometimes that your whole thing can be restaurant relationships or this or that. So we found dishes that we can fit into. So it's the veggie tempura dish, because that's as close as they can get their customers to eating fresh vegetables. It works, and then we can tap into that because we can have some items that they can use in that way. So I think, again, incrementally starting with something like you said, looking at the list, but also finding a dish that can be applied to has been effective.
Great. I think we have, go ahead, Tyler.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think what Andrew said about units is a super important thing and is another reason to look at some wholesale price lists so you can see, if other purveyors that restaurant is working with are selling like lettuce, like romaine, that's like 12 heads to a case. If you just mimic that same system, then at least when they see what you have, even if your prices are higher, they understand what it means. Whereas if you're, like Andrew was saying, if it's a different unit, it's sort of hard to figure it out. And I think the other point is if you're a small farm, you have some inherent advantages over a bigger operation, which have to do with you can give greater care in handling to delicate things. So, most of the startup small-scale farms that I know who are trying to get in with restaurants really focus on things like baby greens, where bigger operations just can't produce the same level of quality. You have to have it clean, but other than that, it's like no matter what you do, it's going to be nicer than what they get from Cisco.
I think asking the things, what are the things that you've not been able to get from Cisco that you do want? And I think we've had some farms that have cold called us in the past, and that first foot in the door is what are the things that you can't get from your current farmers that you would like to see? And there's one farm I'm thinking of that they grow like 4 things for us the entire year. We don't really see them unless it's October, November, and December because they grow fall roots, but they do 4 things. They do it really, really well, and they have their own farmers market and their own CSA. But that has been a great way to begin a relationship, and over the past couple of years, we've expanded that. And so I think if you're able to offer them something, to give them a seed catalog and be like, what is this one thing that we can do that you can't get otherwise, that's a great first step.
Can I just add something to that as well? Something that's worked really well for me is I have a supplier back in London who likes to bring her produce and taste test it next to the generic product right there, and you can automatically pick up the difference, and that for a chef automatically they can be like, I'm going to go with that one. And it's not in an arrogant way or like, what I do is better than this. It's just like, compare the difference.
That's great. So for the live stream audience, the suggestion was to do a side-by-side comparison of your product with a conventional product, and that can be really compelling for chefs to actually taste the difference. I think we have time for one more quick question, and then we'll wrap up. Any more? No? Okay. Any last thoughts from our panel? Oh, yes.
Like, flip the coin a little bit. We're talking kind of mostly about what are the benefits to the farmer. What do you think are some of the benefits to the restaurant to working intimately with a farm, even celebrating like failures as well?
Okay, great question. So the question was, what are the benefits to the restaurant of working so closely with a farmer, including celebrating the failures of the farm, perhaps?
I think this whole restaurant is the expression of that. I think it's the ability to kind of have your menu guided by the exact kind of produce that you want and the produce that you think fits the ideology of the restaurant. And so I feel so lucky that we can, spend all this time in the winter and really plan out our menus for the most part, not the dishes, but the ingredients we're going to use, and be able to create these kind of cool stories or these themes, in January, and be able to have a very rich menu, which if we hadn't contracted and we were showing up to the market, we could have amazing produce in the menu. But I think it would be more challenging to get to that point where there was a narrative that went throughout the meal or some kind of overarching thought to the thing. And so, I don't know, it's very central to, I think, this place to have the farms at the centerpiece and to tell these stories, just because I think that's what's most compelling is, it's not necessarily how do you cook this to make it interesting, but why are we using this product and what are the benefits of working so closely with the farm, and all these things that working with the whole plants that you just don't get from the farmer's market because you have these relationships.
That's great. Thank you. Any final thoughts, Jason, Tyler? Anything else? Add on there? Yeah. Okay, wonderful. Well, I want a huge round of applause for Tyler and Andrew and Jason. Thank you guys so much for sharing your wisdom with us today.